The day of the funeral didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a transfer, quiet, procedural, almost efficient. Nothing lingered long enough to ache. The house absorbed people the way it always had, rooms filling and emptying in predictable patterns, as if muscle memory had taken over and grief was an optional setting no one had turned on. People moved through the house with purpose, not sorrow. Shoes were placed neatly by the door. Coats were hung where they belonged. Conversation stayed low and practical. Drawers opened. Closets were evaluated. My grandfather's belongings were already being reorganized into outcomes. Keep, donate, trash, labels spoken aloud like assignments. Objects were lifted, weighed, and judged. His life reduced to logistics before the day had fully cooled. It didn't feel cruel. That was the strange part. It felt rehearsed, like everyone understood the sequence and simply stepped into their roles, as if my grandfather had only stepped out briefly. And this was what happened when he wasn't watching. I stood near the hallway mirror, the same place I'd stood that morning adjusting my tie. The mirror still held the faint ghost of my reflection from earlier, though now the knot sat looser, slightly crooked. The fabric smelled faintly of his aftershave, something clean and sharp underneath the starch. I hadn't realized how closely I associated the scent with him until it was suddenly inappropriate to notice it. No one asked me to help. No one handed me a box or gave me direction. I wasn't included in the sorting or the decisions. I existed in the house the way an extra chair does, noticed only if it's in the way. I stayed where I was because moving would have required intention, and no one had asked that of me. When the last car pulled away, the house didn't exhale. There was no release, no emotional drop. The quiet that followed felt the same as the noise before it, just less occupied. The rooms returned to themselves. My father didn't sit. He didn't suggest coffee or comment on the weather. He stayed standing, one hand resting on the back of my grandfather's chair. Not gripping it, just touching it, as if confirming its presence, as if it had already accepted him. He told me the house was his now. He said it plainly, without weight or hesitation, like a detail that had always been true and simply hadn't been spoken aloud until now. There was no challenge in his voice, no invitation for response, just information, something I was expected to absorb. Then he handed me a card, a standard envelope, thin, the kind you find on a rotating rack near the pharmacy checkout, neutral colors, no sentiment, the kind you grab when you don't want to linger or explain yourself to the cashier. Inside was a prepaid debit card, $1,000. He said the amount out loud, carefully, as if clarity mattered, as if precision turned it into generosity. He said it like a favor, like a kindness that required acknowledgement. You should be grateful, he added, not sharply, not with anger, just conclusively, the way people close a topic. Given everything. I didn't ask what everything meant. I didn't need to. The word carried its own history. It was a container big enough to hold years of silence, careful phrasing, and conversations that never quite finished. Everything had always existed between us, unnamed but understood. He said adoption the way people talk about the weather, flat, factual, unavoidable. Not as accusation, not as apology, just context, a clarification. As if that single word explained why the house, the furniture, the photographs on the walls would continue seamlessly without me, like a story that had never required my presence to move forward. I nodded. I thanked him. I took the card, and that was that. That night I packed what fit into my car. Not everything, just what could be justified by space and necessity. Clothes folded tighter than usual. Books chosen more for size than attachment. A box of miscellaneous items I didn't remember packing but somehow couldn't leave behind. There was no checklist, no sense of ceremony. I packed the way you do when you already know you won't be coming back. There was no dramatic exit. No confrontation waiting to happen if I stayed long enough. No doors slammed for emphasis. The house didn't resist me. It didn't ask questions. I left the room I'd slept in since I was 8 years old, with the bed still made, the sheets smooth, the pillow centered. It felt important not to disturb it. As if disorder would have implied ownership I no longer had. I paused once in the doorway, not to look back, but to confirm the room was exactly as it should be, neutral, intact, ready to continue without me. Then I turned off the light. I didn't use the card. At the time, I told myself it was pride. That explanation was easy to reach for and hard to challenge. Pride sounded deliberate. Strong, it implied a choice rather than a reaction. I carried it with me like a shield, repeating it when I needed to justify the inconvenience of not having that money. Later, I realized it was something quieter. I didn't want the transaction to complete. Using the card would have meant agreement. Acceptance. It would have closed the exchange neatly, House for card, inheritance for balance, presence for absence. I didn't want the finality of it. I didn't want to accept the terms he'd set. The math he'd decided was fair. As long as the card remained unused, something stayed unresolved, incomplete, so the card went into a drawer. Then another drawer after I moved and forgot where I'd put it. Then into a box with old documents, birth certificate copies, expired IDs, folded letters I never reread. The kind of box you don't label because you don't want to explain it. I carried that box from apartment to apartment like a sealed question, unopened not out of fear but out of deferral. Something I could always deal with later. Life didn't fall apart. That surprised me. There was no collapse waiting on the other side of the door. No dramatic consequence for leaving. Things continued in a way that felt almost suspiciously normal. I found work, not ideal work, not meaningful work, but work that paid consistently and didn't ask too much of me. I rented rooms that already belonged to someone else, learned the etiquette of shared kitchens and borrowed space. I learned how to live lightly, how to make myself temporary without feeling transient. I learned how to explain my family in smaller sentences, sentences that didn't invite follow-up questions, sentences that closed themselves. We're not close. My grandfather passed. I moved out young. I trimmed away details the way you do when you realize accuracy isn't always required. I stopped mentioning the house. I stopped mentioning him. Not because it hurt to talk about, because it took effort to explain what no longer functioned as a story with a clear arc. The absence became ordinary. Not heavy, just unremarkable. Every once in a while, usually while filing paperwork or cleaning out a desk before another move, I'd find the card. It never appeared when I was looking for it. It surfaced the way old receipts do, sliding out from between pages or turning up at the bottom of a box I thought I'd already emptied, still sealed, still untouched, still accusing in its neutrality. It didn't degrade or expire. It didn't demand attention. It simply existed unchanged, like proof of a decision I'd made and refused to finish making. I'd hold it for a moment, feel its weight, less than I remembered, and put it somewhere else. Not thrown away, not used. Deferred again. 5 years passed, quietly, without announcement, without resolution. The reason I finally went to the bank had nothing to do with him. That mattered to me at the time. I wasn't there for answers or vindication or closure. I was consolidating accounts, closing loose ends, doing the kind of maintenance life accumulates when you've been living carefully for a while. The card had an expiration date. That was the practical trigger. I didn't want it floating out there forever, unresolved, attached to my name like an open parenthesis. I told myself this was administrative. Routine. Something that should have been done years earlier but hadn't risen to the level of urgency. I wasn't expecting anything beyond confirmation and disposal. The bank branch was quiet. Midweek quiet. The subdued hum of systems running, keyboards clicking softly behind counters. Fluorescent lights flattened everything into the same shade of neutral. It was the kind of place where nothing important is supposed to happen, where outcomes are limited to receipts and stamped envelopes. I waited my turn. When it came, I slid the card across the counter and said I wanted to cancel it. I said it plainly. Without explanation, the teller picked it up, turned it over once, and began typing. Her expression didn't change at first. Her fingers moved with practiced efficiency, the rhythm of someone who had done this hundreds of times. Then she stopped, not abruptly, just enough to register. She looked at the screen longer than necessary. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus. Then she looked back at me, recalibrating. "I'm sorry," she said carefully, as if stepping onto uncertain ground. "Before I can do that, I need to ask, are you aware this card has an associated balance far exceeding the printed amount?" The phrasing was precise. Rehearsed. Neutral, I told her no. The word came out easily because it was true. There was no hesitation, no defensive tone. Just a simple answer to a simple question. She nodded once, then turned the screen slightly so I could see. Not dramatically. Not as a reveal. Just enough to include me in the information she was already processing. There were more zeros than made sense. Not just more than expected, more than my brain could immediately categorize. The number didn't fit into any framework I had prepared. It sat there, clean and unblinking, refusing to be interpreted. She explained, still in that neutral tone, that the card wasn't a simple prepaid debit. It was a custodial disbursement instrument, tied to an account established years earlier. The $1,000 printed on the card was a minimum, access figure, not the full value. A gate, not a sum. She paused to let that settle, then continued. My grandfather had set it up, not impulsively, years ago, with documentation, with intent. For me, she said the amount. I heard it. I understood it intellectually. I don't repeat it because the number isn't the point. What mattered was the shape of the realization, the way it rearranged things that had already happened without changing a single fact. My father hadn't given me a favor. He'd limited my access. That distinction landed quietly, without drama. It didn't come with anger or relief, just clarity. The kind that makes past moments reassemble themselves differently, words taking on new weight, gestures revealing edges you hadn't noticed at the time. The teller asked if I wanted to speak with a manager. I said yes. The manager arrived with a tablet and a calm voice. She confirmed everything: dates, signatures, provisions. She spoke as someone who trusted the paperwork more than the people involved. My name was there in black ink, steady and unmistakable. Not added later, not amended, present from the beginning. My father's name was there too, as administrator, not owner. No one raised their voice. No one accused anyone of anything. The authority in the room wasn't emotional. It was procedural. The documents didn't argue. They didn't speculate. They simply existed, intact and unambiguous. I signed a form. Then another. Each signature felt oddly weightless, as if I were acknowledging something that had already been true all along. They asked if I wanted the funds transferred or held temporarily. I asked for them to be held. I needed time, not to decide what to do with the money, but to understand what it meant to suddenly stand on ground I'd been told was never mine. When I walked out of the bank, nothing about the day had changed. The sky looked the same. Cars passed at the same intervals. Someone laughed too loudly near the ATM, the sound briefly sharp against the concrete, but something had shifted quietly, completely. For years, I'd believed the story my father told because it fit seamlessly into the way he'd always spoken to me, with certainty, with an assumption of authority that discouraged questions before they formed. He spoke as if facts were possessions, as if naming something made it his to define. I didn't challenge that voice because I'd grown up inside it. I'd learned early that disagreement required more energy than silence. So I accepted the narrative as complete. I built my adulthood around the idea that I'd been dismissed cleanly and legally. That what happened in that living room after the funeral had been final, settled, documented. I treated it as a closed case, something I wasn't entitled to revisit. That belief shaped decisions quietly, how much I expected, how cautiously I planned, how small I allowed my life to remain. The truth, when it arrived, didn't overturn anything dramatically. It was messier and calmer. There was no villain revealed in a satisfying way. No moment where the past collapsed under its own weight. What emerged instead was a subtle correction. A misalignment adjusted by degrees. He hadn't won. He'd postponed. That distinction mattered more than I expected. It reframed the years in between not as punishment or exile, but as delay. Not absence, but withholding. The difference didn't absolve anything, but it clarified it. It stripped away the myth of inevitability I'd been carrying and replaced it with something quieter: contingency. I never confronted him. That, too, was a decision, not avoidance, selection. There was no call where I demanded answers. No scene where he explained himself, softened his voice, or justified his actions in language designed to sound reasonable. I didn't want that version of closure. I didn't want his interpretation added to the record. I had enough information. I didn't need commentary. Instead, I did what required no permission. I updated my address with the bank. I hired an attorney to handle the transfer properly, methodically, without drama. The process unfolded through emails and signatures and waiting periods that felt oddly reassuring in their impersonality. No one asked how I felt about it. No one needed my emotional consent. I moved into a place I chose without compromise. That mattered more than I'd anticipated. Not the size or location, but the absence of negotiation. No settling. No silent adjustments to accommodate someone else's expectations. It was the first space I inhabited that didn't feel provisional. Sometimes I drive past the old house. I don't slow down much. I don't stop. It looks smaller than I remember, its proportions slightly off, as if memory had inflated it beyond its actual dimensions. The porch needs work. The paint has dulled. The yard is overgrown in places my grandfather used to tend carefully, edges softened where his attention once held them in place. I don't feel triumph when I see it. I feel accuracy. Things are the size they are. Time has done what time does. The house hasn't been preserved or punished. It simply continued, imperfectly, without sentiment. The humiliation I carried for 5 years wasn't erased by the truth, but it was reclassified. It no longer belonged to me in the way I thought it did. It belonged to a misunderstanding that had power only because I let it remain unexamined. Once named correctly, it lost its authority. Not its memory, but its leverage. What I gained wasn't revenge. It was confirmation that I hadn't been discarded for being adopted, that generosity had been misnamed. That silence, in the right moment, can be a form of restraint, not weakness. These weren't revelations so much as alignments, things settling into the positions they should have occupied all along. I keep the original card now, clipped to the paperwork, not framed, not hidden away, just there, practical and intact. Not as a reminder of what I was denied, but of what was delayed. A marker of the difference between limitation and truth, between a story told with authority and one supported by fact. The authority that corrected the story didn't shout. It didn't scold. It didn't ask for my forgiveness or my understanding. It simply told the truth and let everything else fall into its proper place.